Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and complementing yesterday's urban warfare special with Major Jason Giroux, who's in the sidebar today. Today, Colonel Greg Fontenot expands on the role of the 1st Division in the wider Aachen campaign. His superb book, No Sacrifice Too Great, I'm holding my copy here, is in the links below. So we'll look at context. We'll look at what made the 1st Division as good as they were at this point of the war. We'll look at the Hurtgen Forest a bit. But I'm delighted to bring Greg in now. Good afternoon, sir. How are you today?
I am well, sir. Thank you.
So the Aachen campaign, I know what you're going to say to this, but is it a campaign in broader terms that is overlooked? There's a lot of stuff happening in September, October 1944. Market Garden is happening and coming to an end. Does Aachen fall through the cracks a bit?
I don't know that it's overlooked, but it does not attract the attention, say, that Market Garden did, or the Hurtgen Forest fight, which is in parallel, nor does it have the attraction of, say, the Battle of Bulge,
Yeah.
which is too bad because this is the first German city to fall to a foreign army in centuries. And so it was very important. And I think contextually, it follows, it begins roughly the same time that the operation in Market Garden began.
Yeah.
It starts a few days before, but contextually, this is at the end of the long pursuit that had begun with the breakout from Cobra at Saint-Lô at the end of July 1944, in absolute concert with the way the U.S. Army thought. The United States Army was built for mechanized and mobile warfare. It wasn't really built to defend. Its tank divisions were small, 3 tank battalions, 3 infantry battalions. So it was built with the intention of infantry would penetrate, tanks would go through, exploit the penetration, and the goal was envelop your enemy, force them out of their position, and pursue them. And all of that happened. One of the things I want to mention before we get into the detail of context are some other things people can read that I recommend to understand the pursuit and how that fit into why things happened the way they did at Aachen. And the other thing people need to understand about Aachen is it's a battle in the sense of multiple engagements over time. So we're talking about 6 weeks of fighting, and we'll get to some of that. But I want to mention several books. Robert Baumer's book, simply called Aachen, is a great study of the fighting associated with the city. That includes the units on the flanks. Harry Yaity's book, The Longest Battle, is a brilliant book about the coming of the fighting in the fall of 1944. Charles B. McDonald's Siegfried Line Campaign is the U.S. Army's official history of it. Rick Atkinson in The Guns at Last Light has an excellent chapter on it. And I like Rückzug, I'll get it here, which is the German retreat from France by Joachim Ludwig. Ludwig is an official historian of the German army, and this gives you the German take on what some Germans call the miracle in the West. But to come to the point in terms of context, and if you would show that map that shows the theater level stuff, and then we'll come back to knock them all down. This map shows the pursuit at scale, and you see the red circle in the center, or center top of the map is Aachen, and it lies where German, Belgium, and Holland all come together. And the other fascinating thing about Aachen is it's about 30 miles from Aachen to the Rhine River.
Yep.
Now, when we landed, we, meaning the Allies, landed in Normandy in June 6, 1944. The logistics planners had to have some idea of where things were going to be when, so they could plan the logistics accordingly. And that's one of the things people need to understand is, you know, an army, Napoleon said, moved on its stomach. Well, the army of 1944, the American army, moved on fuel. So you really, really have to take account for how much fuel is it going to take, how much ammunition is it going to take, what's it going to take in terms of food. And there's data out there in the Army Green Books that show you the scale of this is just unbelievable. But in any event, we broke out in the end of July. And on the September the 11th of 1944, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division and other U.S. units reached the Siegfried line, a line they were expected to reach at D plus 330, which would be May the 2nd, 1945. Instead, we reached the May 2, 1945 line. We're there in September. So several things happened as a consequence of this. One of those things is hubris. We think the war is going to be over any time now. The Germans are beaten, and we know they're beaten because we're at their frontier and we're coming into the place. The very first U.S. unit to enter Germany was a patrol from the Fifth Armored Division, led by Staff Sergeant Warner W. Holzinger, who was born in Silesia. In fact, he was a German who immigrated to the United States. I love the irony of Holzinger, the German speakers, leading this patrol because he does speak German. Across the Our River in Belgium, just a few kilometers south of Aachen, went back that very night, didn't stay. But the point is, we're there really early. So what happens is we had the classic culmination, as Clausewitz would call it. We ran out of fuel. That's really why we stopped. The German army barely got to the Siegfried line before us. And in fact, they didn't so much get there before us as Germany mobilized more troops, drew up fairly poorly trained soldiers to man the fortresses along the Siegfried line. So that's the second thing we need to mention in passing is the Siegfried line is not unlike the Maginot without the big heavy guns in it, but pillboxes supported by obstacles, including the Dragon's Teeth. And it extended all along the German frontier. Now, in Aachen, there are two lines, and we'll get to that in a minute, but there are two lines that we should talk about. Now, to get back to this map, in September of 1944, the 4th of September to be precise, the First U.S. Army turned its 9 divisions and 3 corps to the east. So if you look at the red circle where Aachen is, on the north side of that circle heading east is Charles Cowboy Pete Corlitt's 19th Corps. And on his right is J. Lawton Collins in the 7th U.S. Corps going right at Aachen. And south of him on the right is Leonard T. Giroux' 5th Corps. Now, the First U.S. Army had culminated here because the fuel problem has really gotten difficult. Trucks are making a 300-mile round trip from First Army to the supply dumps and back. The German Army, however, was actually in worse shape than the United States Army, as you might imagine. In September, the Germans in the West had 100 tanks remaining out of 1,552 that they had available on D-Day. 2 of their famous divisions, the 2nd and 2nd SS Panzer Divisions, had 3 tanks between them. However, despite that, the German soldier, the Lanzer, as they called themselves, had not given up. They were determined to defend their homeland. There's a brilliant line in the movie Fury where the infantry company commander says to the tank sergeant, "Why are they doing this? It's March, it's 1945 in March. Why are they still doing this?" And the American tank sergeant says to him, "What would you do in their situation? They're going to fight." And the Germans are absolutely determined to defend their homeland. The other thing I think ought to be mentioned is we had established the doctrine of unconditional surrender. So if you're a Nazi Party official or you're a German officer or arguably even a German soldier, when you're confronted with unconditional surrender, well, what does that mean exactly? Well, it means just what it says, absolute abject surrender. And they knew of the things like the Morgenthau Plan, and they understood that they had irritated the Russians killed 20 million of them. The Russians were going to take revenge. So they had good reason to fight. And also fighting from well-fortified positions. And the Siegfried had declined. It had been allowed to go to seed. But in the fall of 44, the Germans rebuilt parts of it, cleaned it up, and they were able to man, depending on how you read, 36 to 40, quote, fortress battalions. Relatively poorly trained soldiers. But as an American operations officer of a regiment pointed out, if you have a high rate of fire from an MG-42 or MG-38 machine gun and you're shooting out of a pillbox, you're going to do okay even if you aren't trained as a sniper. And so you have morale being boosted in part for the German soldiers because they are defending their homeland, but they have fortified positions that are well protected. Now, as we got into this, when 7th Corps approached Aachen, both Hodges at the First Army, Courtney Hicks Hodges, First Army commander, and his corps commanders, all 3 of them, but Lightning Joe Collins in particular in the 7th Corps, wanted to continue the fight. They wanted to find a way to keep moving. If you culminate, literally have to stop, then the initiative passes to the other side. There are downsides to not being able to keep advancing. So Collins went to Hodges and asked him if he could continue the attack in a limited way. Hodges authorized it as a, quote, reconnaissance and force. And that's, air quotes, because it's a euphemism for I'm going to continue the attack with limited resources.
Yeah, yeah.
So what then happened is Brother Collins and Hubner got together. Now, Hubner had been a soldier in the 1st Infantry Division, War One, commanded a battalion in the 18th Infantry, was badly wounded in the fighting. He was decorated for valor. He had led the 1st Infantry Division at the end of the Sicilian campaign and from D-Day on. And he knew what it was like to fight through these French villages and Belgian villages defended by the Germans. And in the path of the attack were these destroyed villages. I mean, brilliant, brought to rubble, at a great loss of life. And so he wanted to avoid the loss of life at Aachen. So he proposed to Collins that rather than immediately assault through the Siegfried, which is going to take some time and effort, and into the city, and into everything it means about fighting in a city, and that means lots of artillery going to be used, lots of casualties, lots of rubble. It's going to be difficult to maneuver, and the defender has a decided advantage. That what he recommended was that they do a circumvallation or surround the city. Once you encircle the city, and that would include the 19th Corps, Corliss outfits, southernmost unit, the 30th Division. The 2 divisions would have to encircle the city. Once you do that, then it's comparatively easy, because if you encircle the city, that it can't be reinforced. You eventually can starve it into submission, or if you have to, you can go in and take it. So with that, let's go back to the title chart, because it's got a great picture of Aachen. This is Aachen during the fighting. And in the background, and I put the title in a bad place, I covered the peak of Louisburg. That's Louisburg Ridge, which rose above the city. And you can see the smoke and all that is from the fighting in the city. Aachen is surrounded by hills, fairly impressive hills. The altitude, as I remember, the Louisburg is about 600 meters. So it's 1,800 feet above sea level and about 700 feet above the level of the city. So this is, and it's, as I say, it's surrounded by hills. So if we go on to the map that shows the forest, it would be good, the forested region.
Which one's that? That's
just keep unplugging. It'll come up here in a second. Yeah, because we're going to skip some of this.
That one?
So if you look at Aachen, you have Aachen is in the tip of the Hürtgen forest, which is the little bit of a thumb-like forest that sticks out of the Ardennes and the Eifel. These are 3 forests, but they're really one big forest, about 15, 20 miles in width and about 70 miles, as I remember, in length west-east. And this bifurcates the front. North of the Hürtgen and Aachen, and south of the Eifel or Ardennes, and the front is divided into 2. Now, the original thinking was the main effort would be made north of the forest towards Cologne and across the Rhur River, ultimately to cross the Rhine, and you'd cross the Rhine at Cologne or somewhere in there. The other avenue of approach would have been south of that through Saarbrücken towards the Rhine, and then cross, say at Worms or someplace along that part of the Rhine, and aim towards Frankfurt. And if you think about the areas down there, Mannheim, Ludwigshafen, all of those were big industrial centers. But the really big industrial center is north of the forest, in the Ruhr industrial district, Dusseldorf, Essen, those kinds of cities. So one of the arguments, it lasted really till the end of the war, was broad front or narrow front.
Yep.
And both the 21st Army Group's commander, Field Marshal Montgomery, and 12th Army Group's commander favored a narrow front as long as they commanded it. And one of the real beefs here was probably, and this is counterfactual, and I don't get into those, but there is an argument made that we'd have done better if we had concentrated forces north of the forest. In fact, Roger Cirillo essentially made that argument not long ago on your show. I don't necessarily agree with Roger, because what did happen is what we're talking about, not what could have happened. But I don't believe it could have happened for political reasons. There is no way the United States Army was going to turn over 2 field armies to Montgomery and have the main effort made by American troops led by a British general. I'm sorry, the special relationship didn't go to that. Didn't go
Well, I
that
mean,
far.
earlier, yes, but not now. But not by
No,
by July and August, Montgomery is having, whether he likes it or not, to accept the fact he's now playing second fiddle to the US. He's the British and Canadians have been outnumbered by the Americans. It's that the balance has shifted, and you say, well, it's not easy for him to accept the fact he's no longer the top dog, but he is no longer the top dog. So
he is no longer the top dog. He was
it's
made top dog, as you know. He
yeah, he
was
had been, yeah, yeah,
the
yeah,
ground forces component commander for the invasion in the Battle of Normandy. But once the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces could come ashore and the balance of the troops, as you point out, had shifted to the Americans,
yep,
then Montgomery was not going to be the man.
yep.
And that is no discredit to Montgomery. It's just a political fact of life. And the idea that somehow military matters are discrete and separate from political factors is
Yep.
just not so. In any
Absolutely.
case, they decided they would try to achieve a circumvallation of an encirclement of the city, and they would try to deal with the problem of capturing Aachen by preventing reinforcements. Now, Aachen is important for a number of reasons. It's historically significant because in 805 A.D., when it was called Aix-la-Chapelle, Charlemagne is crowned Holy Roman Emperor in that city. So it's an important city simply for the historical significance of the Holy Roman Empire, and it is the first German city that the Allies are going to attack. And bear in mind, the Russians are still not across the German frontier. So this is literally the first German town that's going to be attacked.
Mm.
The second piece of that is that of significance is Aachen is 30 miles from the Rhine River at Cologne.
Yep.
Now, it's important for us to remember that on the 11th of September, 1944, we're 30 miles, a little over 35 miles or so from the Rhine, and we don't cross it till the 7th of March of 1945.
Yeah.
That tells us that the hubris and the celebratory nature of the Champagne campaign through France and Belgium is over. And it's something that the Allies never quite get until I would argue until the Ardennes.
How
That
much
is
of that goes back, Gregory, to the end of the Normandy campaign? Is that all those people you've been talking about earlier, Lawton, Collins, I mean, they've all experienced that attritional phase in Normandy where you've got off the beaches okay, and then you're just stuck. The British are stuck in the wheat fields near Caen, the Americans are stuck in the bocage, Cherbourg takes longer, Saint-Lô takes longer, and then suddenly when Cobra and then for the British Bluecoat happens, suddenly off you go, and the British 11th Armored Division race up the coast. Patton's Third Army races across. They're fighting currently the same week. They're fighting in the west of Brittany. They're fighting in Metz. So everybody suddenly felt that the brakes are off now. It's not first gear now. It's sixth gear all the way to Berlin. So is that part of it? Is that they've had this experience of moving at fast and no one wants to slow down now? And it's like, yeah, we know we've because
I
it
believe
seems
that's
like
exactly what it was. I
it
think it
feels like
was
you're
a
going
physical
backwards. You've gained an advantage, and now, oh, hang on, are we going to slow back to a grind again? No one wants to go backwards.
No, in fact, everything about the United States Army, the way it fought, and I'm speaking about the U.S. Army's culture, juxtaposed to the British Army's culture.
Yeah,
The British Army had dealt with 1940, the fighting withdrawal, the defeat that turns into a victory at Dunkirk,
yeah,
the bitterness of defending North Africa, and then finally getting a second Alamein, the long haul across North Africa. The British by October, November, they're no longer the British Army of 1942. They've been beaten up. They're tired. They're worn out. The Canadians and the Brits together, are a very small part of it. So their culture is a little different because of the exhaustion of the First World War
yep,
and the wearing out of the troops in Normandy and all those things their experience is fundamentally different than ours. And our army is far more mechanized than the British Army, and our doctrine is far more about war of movement. So the Americans have definitely got the victory disease. So do the Brits, but to a lesser extent. In
yep.
fact, I interviewed or actually exchanged letters with an officer who retired as a general. His name was Bill Knowlton. Knowlton was a lieutenant in the cavalry in the 7th Armored Division, and he talked about in the summer of 44. Somebody said, there's some Germans over in that wood. Everybody said, well, let's go get them. He said, by December 1944, there's some Germans over there in that wood. Let's take cover. I mean, the truth changes. The dystopian life of a soldier in the fall and winter of 44, 45 is a lot different than summer of 1944. But in any case, here we are. Those are the woods. And now we got to talk about how do you do this circumvallation. So if you would go to the next one, sir.
All right, that's we got the
This is
photo.
just to give you an idea of what it's like in the Hurtgen. This is 1st Infantry Division in the Hurtgen Force. This is actually, these pictures are actually from November 44. But the point of the Hurtgen is it's dark and gloomy in the summertime and dark and gloomy, wet and cold in the wintertime. It's beautiful country, but it is really thickly forested, and that includes the Schnee Eifel as well as the Ardennes. All of these forests are quite dense. And go on to the next. This shows the edge of the Hurtgen is in the bottom of the photograph. There's a big road that runs from left to right, and you can see it towards the top of the photograph. And to your left, as you look at the photograph, you're heading towards Aachen. To the right, you're heading towards the Rhine. So once you get through the Hurtgen, you're on the river plain or the flood plain of the Rhine and Ruhr rivers, which run through here. So once you break out of the forest, it's pretty straightforward, flat country to get to the river. So this is what we want to do. We want to get through Aachen, and we want to get by the forest as quickly as possible. But the forest lurks on the flank of the effort. And when you look at this map, Aachen's in the center at the top, and those big red swatches with the cross hatches on them are the two different features of the Siegfried line in this area. The first is called the Schill line. The second is the Scharnhorst. And Aachen there is in the center, and then there's a town to the east of it or right called Stolberg. And we got a picture that'll do a little better later. But what I want people to see here is all that forest to the right. Now, that little bit of white space between the forest and Aachen is called the Stolberg Corridor, named for the town that's there. As the 1st U.S. Army went into this area, their concern was that and Courtney Hodges' concern and Collins' concern was, what if the Germans moved into the forest and came out of it and hit us in the flank? Now, ex post facto, and the German generals at the end of World War II said, we never would have done that. But sure enough, when we went into the forest to make sure they did not, guess what they did? They went into the forest in great numbers. And the fighting in the Hurtgen that starts in September doesn't end until December with the counteroffensive, caused about 60,000 casualties on the two sides. It made mincemeat out of units, and it attracted units on both sides like moths to a flame, with the consequence that the fighting was extraordinarily bitter. And you get into these densely forested areas and you get artillery rounds bursting in the treetops. You get what are called, obviously, tree burst, which means splinters of wood. And we say splinter, I'm talking about maybe a foot long and 3 or 4 inches in diameter, are being driven through people's bodies, which is pretty rough on people's bodies. So what 7th Corps is going to do is it's going to use the 1st Infantry Division attacking up the east side of Aachen to take the ridges overlooking the cities. And the 7th or the 19th Corps, 30th Division, is going to come from the north and do the same thing with a link-up plan north of the city as well as to the south of the city. On the right there, you can see the timeline that we mentioned earlier. Market Garden started on the 17th, but the 11th is the beginning of the fight in Aachen. If you would go to the next chart, sir. Well, this doesn't come across as well as I'd hoped it would, but there are several key points here, and maybe you can help me out in orienting folks. But Aachen, again, is in the center. And another reason it's important, you can see lines are radiating out from it. Roads are irradiating in literally all directions. There's I think 5 or 6 main highways coming out of Aachen. And you can also see it's a railway junction. And important railways going from Aachen, Germany, into the Netherlands, Aachen into Belgium, Aachen towards France, and then back towards the Ruhr industrial region. The major towns on the outside of it, to the far right, just above map D, The caption that says Map D is the town of Stolberg. Just to the right of it is the Hurtgen Forest. So now you can see the Stolberg quarters. Not a big deal. That's not wide open space. And then several little towns that are going to become very important. Eilendorf, which is just to the east of the city of Aachen. To the north above Eilendorf is Verlautenhain, which is another important town. And there are three ridges that are noted on this map. And we'll talk ridges, hilltops. We'll talk a little bit more about that. One of those is Crucifix Hill. So the way the 1st Division approached this fight is it approached the fight, and we talked briefly, you and I have talked briefly before about this, is how do you sustain a fight? In this case, it's going to start on the 11th of September and won't end until I think it's the 24th of October when the Germans finally surrender Aachen. How do you sustain that fight? And it goes on, 6 weeks of fighting. This is a pretty big deal. And by the way, the 1st Division went right from there to the Hurtgen Forest, and right from the Hurtgen to a rest area, arriving in the rest area on the 14th of December. And by the 17th, they're on the move back into the fight in the Ardennes. So we're not talking about a lot of time to rest or think about anything here. So as they start, the way they did this is bounding battalions. A battalion would take the lead for the division, with the division attacking more or less in column, which meant that one or more battalions could have a bit of a rest. Remember, though, as you go north and east around Aachen, you also have to garrison the ground you've left. Yep. So by the time you're getting towards the end of September, you've really only got a couple of battalions that aren't committed, and they're going to be the ones that take Verlautenhain. That's the 16th Infantry, and Eilendorf, also the 16th Infantry. And then the guys that will take Crucifix Hill are in the 18th Infantry, and the guys will do the final assault on the city of Aachen are from the 26th. So I'm not going to say a whole lot more about units, because that, without the ability to point at the map, that's going to probably more cause more.
And Jason did a lot of that yesterday, so
we won't
contextual.
We won't work out on that. So the first fight I want to talk about in a little bit more detail is the fight to take Verlautenhain. 2 companies of the 16th Infantry finally get up on Verlautenhain, and that's the little town that's northeast of Aachen. It's on just north of the town of Eilendorf, and I think the viewers could probably read that city.
Yep.
So let's go to the next chart for a second. All right. Let's leave that up. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Better still, this is what I wanted to see. This chart points out the Verlautenhain Ridge, and it also shows Eilendorf much better than the other map did. And you see that railway that runs across the top. The Germans were running that railway even while we were in the ridges overlooking it. They were still able to get supplies and other material into the area. The German units defending this are from the 81st Corps, and I won't get into numbers of regiments and the rest of it because it's too hard to keep track of. But the German army had, as Omar Bradley put it, shown amazing recuperative experiences or capability. And once again, they did here. They found tanks, they found Sturmgeschütz or assault guns, they found troops. In fact, one Volksgrenadier Division disembarked from a train right south of Aachen and went immediately into attack on the ridge at Verlautenhain. Now, they were up the strength, they were pretty well led, but they hadn't been well trained. So it was a bloody, bloody fight. In fact, Joe Dawson, who was commander of Company G of the 16th Infantry, had taken the ridge that later became known as Dawson's Ridge, commented that of the counterattack that he experienced on, I think it was the 12th of October, 17th September rather, that he had hit, one of his platoons had used 6 bandoliers of ammunition. Now, a bandolier is a cotton fabric device for holding M1 clips. Each clip has 8 rounds. The bandolier could hold it 6 clips. So if you have 6 clips, that's 48 rounds times 6 bandoliers, right at 300 rounds. That's a lot of shooting in a 6-hour fight. They killed, according to him, we piled up the Krauts, at least 70 of them, and after we counterattacked to retake a small part of the position they'd lost, there were over 200 bodies for 18 of ours spread over 400 yards. Hubner, who was a veteran of World War I and all of World War II and did Normandy, obviously, noted that, quote, a hell of a fight going on. And he's right. And that went on for weeks. Dawson, after this fight, was so hard. This is a guy who got a Distinguished Service Cross at Omaha Beach.
Yep.
Was so hard that he suffered from what we now understand to be post-traumatic stress syndrome. And they relieved him and got him out of the line. Now, because his colleagues didn't understand it then any better than George Patton did, many of them resented him for, quote, getting off the line with this weak excuse of PTSD, but it was genuine. The place is ravaged already, and we haven't even gotten in the downtown fight. Now, over time, the other thing that happened here is, just before we're going to talk about Crucifix Ridge, and I want to show people where it is. If you look at the upper left-hand corner of this map, there is a little white box, and it says Crucifix Hill, and it points there. And the reason it's called Crucifix Hill is there was, in fact, a crucifix on it that was very large, 30, 40 feet high, and it's destroyed in the fighting. It's been rebuilt since. I've been there. It's a beautiful place, and it, like all these other hills, overlooks the city of Aachen. But if you take Crucifix Hill, having already taken these other hills that have cut the town off to the northeast, and you can link up, and they do eventually, in the little town called Haren, which is in the upper left-hand corner of the map. They link up with the 30th Division there. Now you've cut off the city, and you can turn to the fight on the inside. So let's transition to Crucifix Hill. This is the only thing I'm going to cover in any kind of detail. This is a sketch map that was done for C Company of the 18th Infantry, the soldiers that took the hill. It shows Verlatenheit on the east and Haren on the west. And by the way, German place names often tell you everything you want to know about it. A Heide is a fen or a moor, an open field, not particularly hilly, but like a meadow on top of a hill. And in this case, that is a good description, because now you're going to go uphill to get to Crucifix Hill from the meadow below the hill. Mm. Now, as you look at this, there's dense forest, or not dense forest, a hedge is what it amounts to, of trees on the south side. Each of those numbered circles are pillboxes. So you can see, and if you look at it, it shows sectors of fire. These things were overlapping fields of fire that enabled crossfire. So Charlie Company of the 1st Battalion, 18th Infantry Regiment, is going to take this. They are led by a man named Bobby E. Brown. They were pulled out of the line, I'm going to say on the first part of October. I can't see what it is, but it would have been on about the 4th of October, because the attack actually happens on the 8th. You can see 7 through 9 is what they show, but the attack actually happened on the 8th. So they get about 4 days out of the line. And what they're going to do, because you can see down on the hill, bear in mind now, the Verlatenheit had been taken by the 16th Infantry. So you can look down the hill, and we own the ground to the south. So every day, for several days, Bobby Brown and his officers and his NCOs would rotate their way up so they could all see it. And they then plotted all these bunkers. So they had the time to examine the ground in detail. And as they put it in their official account, when the final day came, the picture of Crucifix and its defenses was indelibly inscribed in our minds. We knew it like we knew Omaha Easy Red Beach prior to D-Day. And if you ever watch The Longest Day, you've seen the guys talking over a sand table or terrain board about the fight, who's going to do what. That's the kind of detail you plan, where you're doing the kind of fighting these guys are doing. And oh, by the way, the detailed street fighting that you heard about, if you've watched yesterday's television show, you would have seen the same level of detail to plan. You get a city plan, street by street. You want to know where the streets are. You may not know where all the Germans are, but you're going to know which buildings you have to take when. So by the time of the attack, the pillboxes and known positions were marked on each map and the sequence in which they were to be taken. This fight took place in essentially 3 phases. The 18th Infantry's Battalion had in support a specially trained, quote, Ranger platoon, and C Company, when it got there, had those guys in support, and they had, I think it was 4 tanks and 4 tank destroyers, which got up on the hills around and supported. And bear in mind, there was a lot of artillery being fired. In September of 1944, the 1st Infantry Division fired 30,000 rounds of 105 and 155 rounds. In October, they fired 94,842 rounds in and around the city of Aachen. So we're talking about steel flying everywhere. The Germans managed to fire several tons of artillery from 276 guns and howitzers that the 81st Corps and supporting Army artillery had. So this fight is set up with air support, direct fire support from tank destroyers and tanks, the heavy machine guns of the weapons company of the regiment, the weapons of the weapons platoon of each of the companies, which included 60 millimeter mortars and 30 caliber machine guns. This is going to be a hell of a firefight. But what's even more important is how they organize for the fight. If you were to look at Omaha Beach or Sword or Juneau, each of those amphibious craft organized in a specially equipped boat section. So you had guys with ladders, guys with Bangalore torpedoes, other guys with specialized equipment that would allow them to reduce pillboxes. The same thing happened here. And they included several different features, one of which was a pole charge. You don't want to go up to the aperture of a pillbox and try to shove a satchel charge through the aperture, because if you do, the bad guys are going to shoot you. So one of the things you can do is you put your charges on the end of a pole and you shove that through the aperture, and then set a fuse from the back end of the pole, so nobody has to be in front of the aperture to get shot. The other thing you can do is, if you can find your way using smoke to keep them from being able to see, you get to the iron door, steel door rather, that secures the aperture of the door to the bunker. You blow that open, and in some cases it took as much as 80 to 100 pounds of high explosive to do that. That gets you into the bunker, and once you get the bunker, you pierce the door to the bunker, or you blow up a satchel charge in the aperture. The guys inside are discouraged enough often to surrender. Now, the company commander, in several instances, found that it was easier for him, and I think this is because of his personality, to take the bunker himself, and he did that in several instances. By the time the fighting peters out, this starts at 4 o'clock in the morning. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Bobby Brown has finally secured, I think it's 26 bunkers in the top of the hill. He's been wounded 3 times and refused evacuation. He settles into a bunker with his first sergeant. The first sergeant makes him a cup of coffee because, as Brown pointed out in a post-war paper he wrote for the infantry school, these bunkers had heaters in them. The Germans were living quite well, by contrast to the Americans at that point. So Brown takes the Crucifix Hill, and it's over the next 4 days from the time they take it. They take the hill on about the 9th, and somewhere around the 12th or 13th, multiple German counterattacks come in. They're desperate to retake Crucifix Hill or Verlauten Heights. They've got to find a way to open the railway up to resupply the city and to bring additional troops in. They are not successful. The 1st Infantry Division at this point has had 2 battalions that they've pulled out of the line to train. That is the 2nd and 3rd battalions of the 26th Infantry, one of them led by a man named Driscoll and the other led by a man named John T. Corley. And the regiment is commanded by a guy named J.F.R. Seitz. They go in supported by both tank destroyers, and SP-155, self-propelled howitzers. So 155 howitzer is 155 millimeters. And if you do the quick math, 2.5, 25 millimeters to an inch, you come up with a pretty good sized gun. It's about a 7-inch, not quite 7 inches, a little more than 6. When I was a tanker, I had a 105 millimeter main gun to start with, which is 4 inches, right at 4 inches. And then I had 120 which is a little bit more than 5 inches. So you're talking about a pretty big projectile. And they would use these along with the tanks to make, quote, mouse holes in the side of buildings. Now, some of the German buildings, when a 155 pulled up and shot a mouse hole in it, the mouse hole would be used for the infantrymen to get in. And the infantrymen would go in with throw a grenade in or throw a satchel charge in or use a flamethrower, get in there, kill the occupants or drive them out. And sometimes with the 155, you made a mouse hole going in, it would go through the building and make a mouse hole on the other side. If you had 2 buildings together, depending on how they're constructed, you might make mouse holes in 2 or 3 buildings. But that is how they finally took the city. And if you think about that picture at the beginning, you could see all of that going on.
Mm.
This street fight goes on until the 24th of October, when Oberst Wilk, who commanded the division that was defending the city, surrendered.
And Jason made a big point yesterday of the importance of the big self-propelled guns, the M12s, things like that. And I was going to ask you as well, Gregory. This is one of the fundamental lessons learned earlier in Normandy is you can never have too much firepower. The Americans now are using everything they've got. They're using their anti-aircraft guns on their half tracks to rip up stuff. They're using SB guns and tank destroyers and tanks. And, if you've got it, use it. And I also think they've kind of taken a little bit of the idea from the British of massed artillery, and if you've got it, use it. Not, as you said, 94,000 rounds fired by the division in October. I think earlier perhaps in the Normandy campaign, maybe even Sicily and Italy, there's kind of a hesitancy to use too much firepower. It's a bit kind of gauche to use too much firepower. But I think by this point of the war, it's like, no, we just use everything we've got, and there's no such thing as too much. Is that a fair comment?
Oh yeah, and I would. The only place that I disagree with anything you said is the only guys that could mass artillery better than the British were the Americans.
Yeah,
and that was because of the way we changed our fire direction systems. But both the Brits and the Americans understood that the motto when I was growing up in the Army is "Send a pro Joe, so Joe don't go."
Yeah,
and the Germans complained frequently about the Americans and say, "Look, these guys aren't very elegant. They didn't do a lot of, fancy maneuver. They just blow us up with artillery." In fact, at one point, the division commander in Aachen, or the corps commander, Friedrich Schock, complains that there's so many American airplanes that they can afford to attack messengers on motorcycles and guys in Jeeps, the Kugelwagen. So we had a plethora of firepower and use it. I mean, that's the rule. I mean, I am wearing my United States Air Force World War II logo hat because if you care enough to send the very best, show up with air power in big numbers. It's the idea that you would go to a knife fight and not bring a gun is ridiculous.
Yeah, exactly.
Never fight fair. Darrell M. Daniel, who commanded one of the assault battalions in the town, I said Driscoll earlier. It's Darrell M. Daniel had 226. His motto for taking Aachen was knock them all down. He's talking about the buildings.
Yeah.
And they did that when the Germans finally surrendered on the 24th of October. And we've got a great picture in there. If you want to flash forward, we'll show the picture of the surrender. On the left-hand side, the guy on the very far left of that picture is Clarence Hubner, the division commander of the 1st Division. The guy in the middle is JFR Seitz. The guy on the right is John T. Corley. Wilk is the guy you see in the Jeep. You see the American driver looking kind of, man, I don't know. I hope this guy doesn't give me any trouble. In the far back on the far right side is a guy named, I just did a brain dump. He was a Polish guy, served in the 26th Infantry. Doble, Sergeant Major Ted Doble. Doble started out in the 26th Infantry as a private. He held every rank in that infantry regiment up to Sergeant Major. Was in the regiment for not quite 30 years. He lived a couple of doors down from my family when we were stationed at Fort Riley. Doble was quite the guy. Anyway, he fought all through World War II with the 26th. Corley, after the war, went and commanded the 24th Infantry Regiment, all African-American regiment in the Korean War, won a 2nd Distinguished Service Cross with them, and later on admitted to PTSD, a nervous breakdown, if you will, and the Army put him out, which is kind of sad. The other sad story I want to give a quick tale of, and then let people ask questions or offer criticism is Bobby Brown was commissioned directly. Brown had joined the Army, lying about his age, said he claimed he was 17 or 18, I think it was. He was actually 15, joined the Army in 1918, fought in World War I. Robert York, the battalion commander of the 1st of the 18th, picked him, commissioned him, and made him a company commander because he was just that good in combat. So Brown had no education, had not finished high school. At the end of World War II, he was retired. He worked as a custodian, a janitor at West Point in one of the cadet barracks, and he committed suicide in 1970. I don't know what demons haunted him, but the guys that came through the kind of experience, I mean, Brown was wounded 11 times in combat, and he took this kind of fighting to heart, and it, obviously he had demons. And so the end of the fighting in Aachen, the 1st Division G2 sent in one of his officers, who later happened to be the editor of the New Yorker magazine. He sent this guy in. He said, "I want you to do an assessment of the city and come back and tell me what you found." He was looking at what's the condition of the trolley tracks and so forth. And the guy came back and he said that Aachen was like a Roman ruin, except that it had not decayed with the kind of gentleness over time. It had been turned into a Roman ruin literally overnight. And that is true. Aachen was turned into rubble. And, you know, the moral was, it isn't going to be easy taking Germany. And the Germans, the last counterattack of the German army was on the 7th of May in Berlin against a Russian unit. So these guys fought to the bitter end, literally. And the fact that Wilkes surrendered was so humiliating to him, because he had intended to fight to the last man, but he finally had to give in. And you can see the dejection in that picture on the right. So we planned on an hour.
No, we've got your lessons learned. I like that slide you said there. Let's have a look at that.
Yeah, so at the end of every operation, the way the 1st Division maintained tactical excellence was it always did detailed after-action reviews, and they did them down at least inside battalion level. And I've talked to several enlisted soldiers that said that they did them less informally, even at squad level. Here's what we did wrong. Here's what we can do better. Well, why would you do that? Well, because learning saves your life. Experience is a matter of critically analyzing what you've done to see how you can do better. So these are some of the lessons that were, quote, learned or relearned at Aachen. There were about 4 pages of them in the 1st Division's report or after-action report. And it lays out things that everybody, you know, some of which seem obvious. I outlined the blue ones because this dealt with things that I think are particularly interesting from the perspective of learning. Detailed, deliberate attack tactics, techniques, and procedures for attacking fortified positions. They thought about how to do that. They'd had to do that on Omaha Beach. They'd had to do it every time they'd come in contact with Russians and towns. So you develop tactics, techniques, and procedures specific to the conditions in which you find yourself. That, in my mind, is an important one. And finally, in support of by-fire operations, quote, tank platoon leaders usually dismounted and led their platoon on, preceded the platoon, moving with the infantry so he could be sure he had his tanks in the right place to support the infantry. When you talk to tankers of the modern day army, you used to have jokes, you know, death before dismount, don't get off the tank, something bad will happen to you. But the point is, you do what you must do in order to effectively, to do the mission effectively. You do what you must do. And then you see the others. One of my favorite ones is flat trajectory fire is most effective against concrete masonry. Why, yes, that's true. You go right through most of the things that we're talking about here. So in each fight, and apropos of this, at the end of June of 1944, the 1st Division wrote a 41 or 2 page after-action review on how to better do amphibious operations. They had no reason to believe they would never do another amphibious operation, but they wanted to get that down. Yep. Several regimental commanders wrote their own keys. George Taylor, the man on Omaha Beach, who said there's only 2 people on this beach, the dead and those who are about to die, wrote a how to fight in forest piece, and he wrote a how to fight the Germans piece. So at the end of this, the 1st Division doesn't get a break. They go right into the Hürtgen Forest, and they continue the fight there until, as I think I said earlier, about the 14th of December, they're pulled out of the line. And on the 17th, the 26th Infantry Regiment's ordered back into the fight to support the 99th Infantry Division in the fight at the Ardennes. So these things, the people overuse the word seamless, but this fighting was seamless. It went from one section to another. The other thing I think needs to be thought of as a lesson learned is the sequence in which operations occur is vital too. If you need to take Crucifix Hill, then you have to take Eilendorf first. If you really need to take Crucifix Hill, you then must take Verlautenheide. If you really need to take Crucifix Hill, you have to provide fire support for the approach march of the 18th Infantry so they can cross through Verlautenheide and then attack the hill unimpeded. So each of these things, operations do not happen, with a wave of the arm. This was a series of deliberate attacks planned with decent reconnaissance and a pretty good idea who the enemy was. And I think those are important things, and it contributes to the reputation for excellence of the 1st Division.
Brilliant. Well, let's deal with a couple of questions. And we'll start with mine, really. And that is one of the fundamental things the US Army and indeed the British and Canadians have got better by this point of the war is communication between the different branches. You look back to some of the dark days early in the war. Tankers don't work well with infantry and tank artillery. Is communication getting better with ground and air, artillery and tankers? I mean, it seems to me what Jason said yesterday, there's a lot of fluidity to the ability for the 7th Corps to be able to keep things going and keep these assets working in parallel. Is communication the key to that?
Absolutely. And by communication, I know you mean more than radios and telephones. What you're talking about here is, and maybe I didn't make it clear, these operations are planned at battalion and regiment, but they're executed at platoon, company, squad.
Yeah.
And when I say platoon, company, squad, I'm talking about combined arms. If you remember that first bullet on the lessons learned was the coordination of heavy weapons in the maneuver fight is of the first importance. So a combined arms fight, in the way they organized, you would have an infantry company, I mentioned this, with their own weapons platoon, but then it would be reinforced as appropriate by the weapons company in the regiment, which included howitzers, by the way, and tank destroyers and tanks. And in this fight, I didn't talk about it, but they also had combat engineers with them because, bear in mind, they're having to fight their way through obstacles as well. So the ability to fight small unit combined arms operations is critical. One of the other things about this is junior officers must be taught the proper use of tank destroyers. Well, the tank destroyers were the best tank killing weapons on the battlefield, so you better have your guys understand how to use those. So that's a great question, and it absolutely is true that communications, as you and I are talking about, have dramatically improved. And the American Army by this time had learned on the job. So did the Canadians, and the British had learned these lessons the hard way in North Africa, and so had gotten they were quite good at it.
Yeah, we're all getting better than the dark days. So, Sheldrake, who is a general in artillery in the Canadian Army, he's talking about US. He says UK and US artillery doctrine is quite different. US is based on abundance, give Corps all the guns they need to succeed. UK is based on scarcity, maximum flexibility to mass fires across an army. So Sheldrake's just showing off his extra artillery knowledge there, which is always fantastic. Someone's mentioning the fact that there doesn't seem to be much reference to bazookas. In that, someone asked that yesterday. Is it because the Allies have something better than bazookas? In the bazookas, we're kind of thinking of the German Panzerfaust kind of handheld weapon, but the Allies, if you've got M12s, things like that, why bother with bazookas?
The bazookas weren't of a great deal of use in a street fight or against bunkers. Bazookas were really good against armor. And particularly if you could take advantage of the weak spots. Tanks are vulnerable on the underside, and they're vulnerable to the flanks. So you really do want to use bazookas then. But the other thing we didn't use, they thought they were going to use a lot of, was they didn't use a lot of the flamethrowers.
Right.
They didn't find that the flamethrowers were as effective as they thought they might be. Whereas it seems in the Pacific they used them more.
Okay, thank you. So another question we had, Roderick is saying, and this is kind of more about the impact on the personnel. You know, you talked about the learning taken away from this, and they're writing up the studies, they're evaluating it. Was the first ID heavily impacted by casualties at Aachen? Because as Jason made point yesterday, as successful, although time-consuming as the Aachen campaign was, it was costly on casualties, not overshadowed to some extent by the Hurtgen, but the first take a lot of hits in this, don't they?
Yes, they did. They're in G Company, 16th Infantry. You know, the outfit that took the ridge outside of Rautenheide. They lost 25% casualties, which is, you know, I think he had 7 or 8 dead, 19 or 20 wounded. You know, roughly, an infantry company had about 200 people. So if you lose, you know, 40 guys, you're losing 25%. So he had, I think my math was wrong, but he had about 25% that he lost. And I think it was 9 or 10 dead and the rest wounded. So you're talking about 35 or 40 wounded. The loss rate in the city fighting wasn't as bad because they literally brought the buildings down around the Germans. The casualty rates in Hurtgen were higher, but this was not free.
Yeah. Terry Down, who's done some studies in the past comparing the British 50th Division with the American 1st Division, and we'll eventually have Terry come on and talk about that. He's noticing the comment there about the timidity of tank destroyers. And he says the 50th Division had the same complaint against their M10 crews kind of in this kind of era of the war. What's your take on the tank destroyers? I mean, I'm writing right now about 8th Corps in Normandy, and tank destroyers are doing things that they're really not supposed to do. They're being used as artillery. They're busting holes through hedgerows. But how good is tank destroyer doctrine at this point of the war, from your point of view?
Well, the tank destroyer doctrine had early on been discarded, in fact, because the U.S. doctrine was, and it's very explicit when you read the division and below doctrine for armor forces, they don't fight tanks. What they do is they exploit penetration by infantry. Tank destroyers fight tanks, and they expect to fight them in a defensive position. In other words, you're bushwhacking the tanks. That doesn't turn out to be possible. You know, the Germans don't play that way. So as early as El Qatar in North Africa, the U.S. tank destroyers are the chief way of keeping the infantry from being destroyed, because the infantry gets easily overrun. But the infantry learn, if you let them go past you, you can shoot them in the backside. And oh, by the way, the tank destroyers will take it. The 50th Division experience is not particularly unusual in the 1st Division in the early days, but I think by the time that the Ardennes rolls around, things are much improved, and I think it's a matter of learning throughout. And the other thing, I think, in sympathy for the M10, the M18, and the M36 tank destroyers, is they have a turret but no cover.
Yeah.
So they're out and about. You're trading 76 millimeter rounds with German 75s or German 88s, and you don't have the benefit of cover on your turret. I have some sympathy for that. There's a great site. The Tank Destroyer Association maintains a great site with AARs and all that.
Yep.
I'd urge people to look at. And for your friend from the 50th Division, the 50th Division and the 1st Division, in fact, fought alongside each other in Normandy.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think with a mutual respect. I'm not an expert on British military history, but I know the 50th Division certainly had a good reputation.
Yeah, that came up in the show with Steve Clay back a few weeks ago. So Jason is just adding from last, he's saying bazookas were used, however, they were overshadowed by the use of larger weapons platforms. So I think that's probably echoing what you were saying there.
Yeah.
Completely off the wall, different question, but I think you'll have an answer. James Murphy is saying, was Samuel Fuller in the Aachen melee?
Yes, Fuller was, and thanks for bringing that up. And I don't know how many of your viewers know who Sammy Fuller is.
We've done an entire show on Fuller back in the
Yeah,
day.
well, Fuller was a very successful producer of movies, everything from westerns to war movies. In fact, his best war movie was probably Steel Helmet, which is set in Korea. But in every movie Fuller ever made, somewhere along the line, there's a reference to the 1st Division.
Yep.
Even in the westerns, a patch will show up that shouldn't be there. The flash of the First Division, steel helmets set in Korea, yet all the maps show First Infantry Division units on them. It's
Yeah.
really kind of bizarre.
And the veteran is a veteran from Omaha Beach, isn't he? The
Yes, he is a
sergeant,
veteran of
Gene
Omaha
Evans. Yeah.
Beach. He
And
fought.
he
He joined the
mentions it,
First
doesn't he?
Division in North Africa in the
Yeah.
26th Infantry Regiment, and he was working for Colonel George Taylor. When Taylor moved to the 16th Infantry Regiment, he brought Fuller with him because Fuller was an artist extraordinaire and a great writer. So Fuller became, even though he had joined the infantry to avoid being an Army journalist, he became the personal journalist of the 16th Infantry Regiment. And they wrote, they published every month something called the Dagwood Dispatch. The Dagwood Dispatch was a mimeographed set of sketches that Fuller did. And they were really good. They're characters. I mean, the guy was a brilliant cartoonist. And a write-up to explain to the soldiers what had happened the previous month. Dagwood, by the way, came about because that was their telephone code name. So if you answered the phone as the commander of the 16th Infantry, you'd say Dagwood 6 over.
Yep.
And the Dagwood Dispatches to this very day is the title of the Regimental Association's newsletter. So that was a great question, and yes, Fuller was there.
And to kind of begin to wrap things up, you've looked at the after action reports, you've read the kind of the infantry school reports. The veterans that you've read accounts from and maybe interviewed, where does Aachen rank in their kind of shitty battles of World War II? Is it something that, when it came up at reunions would cause lots of kind of tears, or is it something they're proud of? Where does it rank? Because, British airborne at Market Gardener, for example, or the British in Longstop Hill in Tunisia, there are those certain battles that if you were there, you kind of go, yeah, that was a tough one. Where does Aachen rank?
There, in the pantheon of bad deals in the First Division, El Guitar was one where they learned how to fight outnumbered and win, how to fight against tanks with literally no tanks on their team. So that is a remarkable memory for some of them. In Sicily, the fighting in Troina and going from hilltop to hilltop, where every fight was a new and difficult matter. One of the veterans said, it seemed like every time he fought, he was fighting uphill. He hoped someday to fight downhill. And of course, Omaha Beach stands out as one of the big ones. The counterattack of the Hermann Goering Fallschirmjäger Panzer Division in Sicily was a big one if you were there. Aachen, I think Aachen fits in as one of the commanders said, I think it was Stan Mason, the chief of staff of the division, said that everybody had now understood that the good days of the pursuit were over. And from the beginning of the fight at Aachen, really till the end of the war, the fighting is bitter, scary, miserable, and your estimate of your likelihood of surviving seems to go down. I'm just read Raymond Gattner's account of his experience in World War II as an infantryman. He was a Phi Beta Kappa key holder of one of the American universities. A high-end guy, and he calls his book "Roll Me Over." Roll me over and do it again. And he's not talking about anything fun. He's talking about the experience. He joined the division right after Aachen. And the old veterans are describing Aachen as the height of misery, but then there's a new height of misery when they go to the Hurtgen. Then there's a new height of misery when they go into the northern shoulder on the Battle of the Bulge. And then when they think everything's over, it's all going to be easy from now on, they do an assault crossing the Weser River, and they have the Harz Mountain campaign in April of 45. So I think Aachen is a defining moment.
No, I agree. And I think what I'm learning this week is you can have a campaign, because Aachen is successful. Hurtgen Forest less so, but Aachen, it does work. The clearing of the city does work. They do that job. And the professionalism comes through, and yet it does incur casualties. I think you're entering that era where even if you're doing the job well, you're still coming. It's still a meat grinder. It's still traumatic. It's still bringing lots of casualties. And I think that's the era. And as you say, it kind of only gets worse. And I think if we don't talk enough about the other battles of the winter. Look, it gets even, get to sort of March and April 1945, when a lot of people just skip straight from the end of the Battle of Bulge to VE Day as if nothing happened. It's just mopping up now. It's not fucking mopping up. It's Germans absolutely defending to the last man, every village, every creek, every and the British, everybody's knackered now. As we said earlier, the British, the Canadians, if you're still in the line by the spring of 45, even if you only landed in Normandy a few weeks earlier, you're knackered. And a lot of people have been fighting since North Africa and beyond. Everybody is on they've used the last of the gas. They're running on vapor. Everybody just wants to go home, and the battles just kind of get worse and worse to some extent.
Well, I was only in I led a brigade in Bosnia and a tank battalion in Desert Storm. And I remember driving across the rear area of the division that we overwhelmed in the breach. We breached their obstacles and took them down that first day. And I'm driving with my tank battalion task force through the rear area of this outfit. And you're looking at the detritus of a beaten army, a blanket here, a soldier's boot and a helmet here, that kind of thing. I'm thinking, God, we're beating these guys 99-0, and my life sucks. What must their lives be like? So here you are, you've just won the Battle of Aachen, and you're an infantryman. It doesn't matter. There's no champagne and toast. Let's get the after-action reports, clean our weapons, because we're now on the move to the Hurtgen Forest.
Yeah.
And that's Gatner's story. And every one of these veterans whose stories I've had a chance to read or interview, they'll tell you there's nothing good about it. And the moment it all changed for the infantrymen, it doesn't change for the higher echelons until they're confused, confounded, and astounded by the counteroffensive in the Bulge. But for the guys on the ground in the 1st Division, the infantrymen and the platoons and squads at Aachen, I think they knew the good times were over.
Yeah.
The good times were that great.
Yeah, we're kind of going down a rabbit hole, but the good times of the victory parade in Rome that Mark Clark led, the good times of the parades through Paris, they were exceptions to the rule, really. Yes, they kind of fill up the airwaves. You can just go online on YouTube and find all the crowds grateful him, but that doesn't happen after that. It's just, as you say, it's towns in ruins, people in the streets begging, it's homelessness, it's misery, it's starvation. It goes on, and we should mention Philip Blood, who's on again tomorrow. The impact of this end of war atmosphere influenced the occupation. So he's going to be talking about the Americans and the Brits in Aachen. So that's tomorrow's second appearance by Dr. Philip Blood. So I'm just referencing that tomorrow evening. But we've got a show tomorrow afternoon as well, folks. Christopher Jarry is coming on to talk about the British 30 Corps, 30 miles up the road in the Geilenkirchen area. And I'm really looking forward to that one, because Christopher's going to talk about his father, Sidney Jarry, author of the incredible book 18 Platoon, who go through the ringer as well. There'll be lots of personal stories from Christopher tomorrow about the Dorsets in Dorset Wood near Geilenkirchen. And Philip Blood will carry on about the aftermath of the Aachen campaign. So Gregory, it's been absolutely amazing talking to you. I will invite you back to do something next, maybe in the spring of 45 for the next year, or something about the Bulge or whatever. I don't know, but I don't feel I've finished tapping your brain for the information you have within. So
love to do it. Love to be back. I think you've run a great show, and I love the questions that came up. And I'd love to argue with that artilleryman about whose artillery was best.
Yeah, well, let's do that.
By the way, artillery wins wars, man. It still does. Look at what's going on in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think we can argue that we can't quite name it's a sliver of difference between the Americans and the British at this point. But what we can definitely agree is the German artillery by this point is definitely past its best. The Germans are struggling. But anyway, it's been great talking to Gregory. So folks, I'm back for 2 shows tomorrow. See you again tomorrow. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Cheers, everybody. Bye.